In this video I'm going to talk a little bit about communication devices when you're on a boat, mostly coastal cruising, and a little bit about what to use when offshore cruising. When you're coastal cruising, which we normally think of as being within sight of land, then you'll almost always have the option of using a VHF, and you might sometimes also be able to use your mobile phone. But when we're relying on a communication device, coastal cruising, it'll almost certainly be the boat's built-in VHF. We do also have a portable handheld VHF, which is useful as a backup for the main VHF. And also, if we were to have to abandon Kittiwake for any reason, then this could come with us and we could still communicate with nearby ships, and if we were close enough with land as well. To use a VHF on a boat, you have to take a VHF license, and that's really worthwhile. It's not just a sort of tick box exercise, but the one I did before we left was actually really informative, and I learned a lot on that, and it was really good at teaching you ways of remembering things like mayday calls, for example, and when to use a mayday. And so I'd really recommend doing that. It's really worth it. Even if you're just using a portable like this one, you still need a license, and it's still really worth doing as well. The VHF works by what's called line of sight. So if your VHF antenna can see another VHF antenna, then you should be able to communicate with that person. The obvious drawback of that at sea is that you can only see as far as the horizon. But if you manage to get the antenna at the top of your mast, for example, then that communicating with a Coast Guard station, which will have a really high mast, or another boat, which will obviously also have an antenna at the top of the mast, means that the range is much further than you can see, and it typically can be up to around 20 miles. Obviously, if you're using a handheld radio, then the line of sight is going to be much more restrictive, because you're going to be at sea level, or maybe 6 feet above sea level. So in that sense, it's way better to have a VHF aerial mounted at the top of the mast. So if you're beyond 20 miles from the coast and there's no other ships around, then obviously you can't use a VHF radio to communicate with shore. So in that instance, you need something that's designed for offshore communication. So those sorts of things are going to be an SSB radio, which is a radio which works over different bandwidth, which means that the distance it can see is much further, or something satellite based like a Garmin InReach, or if you're in an emergency situation, then something like an EPIRB, which is a beacon which sends out a distress signal to satellite search and rescue satellites, and then also emits a radio signal for people to home in on exactly where you are. If you're looking for a handheld VHF or an EPIRB, then check out the Wetsuit Outlet website where you can find both.